Okay, we're going to read chapter 2 of Beyond the Deepwoods by Paul Stewart and Chris Riddell. I love the illustrations, they're so good. Published by David Filkling Books. David Filkling. Okay, so we'll talk about chapter 1. Remember, it's about Twig, and his family are wood trolls, but the mom is telling the story of his birth and how he didn't talk, and he's talking about how he was bullied because he looks different. And we find out at the very end that he wasn't born to them. They found him right outside their door. And he was named Twig by the, like an elder. How he thought differently than everyone else. And then right at the end, we find out that he's being sent away because one of the sky pirates was interested in him, and his parents are afraid that they're going to steal him, so they're sending him off to an aunt's house. Okay, the Hoverworm. The sounds of the deep woods echoed loudly all around as Twig walked along the path through the trees. He shivered, tightened his scarf, and pulled up the collar of his leather jacket. He hadn't wanted to leave that evening at all. It was dark and cold. But Spelda had been insistent. "There's no time like the present," she'd said several times as she got together the bits and pieces that Twig would need for his journey. A leather bottle, a rope, a small bag of food, and most precious of all, his naming knife. Twig had finally come of age. "Anyway, you know what they say," she added as she reached up and tied 2 wooden charms around her son's neck. "Depart by night, arrive by day." Twig knew Spelda had been putting on a brave face. "But be careful," she insisted. "It's dark out there, and I know what you're like. Forever dreaming and dawdling and wondering what's around the next corner." "Yes, Mother," said Twig. "And don't yes, Mother me," said Spelda. "This is important. Remember, stick to the path. If you want to steer clear of the fearsome Glomglozer, we wood trolls always stick to the path." "But I'm not a wood troll," mumbled Twig, tears stinging his eyes. "You're my little boy," said Spelda, hugging him tightly. "Stick to the path. Wood trolls know best. Now be off with you, and give my love to Cousin Snetterbark. You'll be back before you know it. Everything will be back to normal. You'll see." Spelda couldn't finish. The tears were coming thick and fast. Twig turned and set off down the shadowy path into the gloom. There she is, waving goodbye. Normal, he thought. Normal? I don't want things to be normal. Normal is trod bladder games. Normal is felling trees. Normal is always being left out, never belonging. And why should it be any different at Cousin Snetterbark's? Being press-ganged into crewing a sky ship suddenly seemed more appealing than ever. The sky pirates roamed the skies above the deep woods. Surely their airborne adventures must be better than anything down here on the forest floor. A desperate howl of pain echoed through the trees. For a second, the deep woods were still. The next second, the night sounds returned, louder than before, as if each and every creature was rejoicing that it was not the one who had fallen prey to some hungry predator. As he walked on, Twig began putting names to the creatures he could hear out there in the treacherous deep woods, away from the path. It helped to calm his pounding heart. There were squealing quarms and coughing fromps in the trees above his head. Neither of them could harm a wood troll, at least not fatally. Away to his right, he heard the chattering screech of a razor flit about to dive. The next instant, the air was filled with the scream of its victim, a wood rat, or perhaps a leaf gobbler. Some way further on, with the dark path still stretching out in front of him, the forest opened up. Twig stopped and stared at the silver moonlight that snaked along the trunks and branches and gleamed on the waxy leaves. This was the first time he had been out in the forest after dark, and it was beautiful, more beautiful than he had ever imagined. With his eyes gazing up at the silvery leaves, Twig took a step forward, away from the shadowy path. The moonlight bathed him in its cold glow and made his skin shine like metal. His billowing breath gleamed snow bright. "Incredible," said Twig, and took a couple of steps more. Below his feet, the glittering frost cracked and crunched. Icicles hung down from a weeping willow oak, and the beads of liquid on a dewdrop tree had frosted and frozen, and glistened now like pearls. A wispy sapling with fronds like hair swayed in the icy breeze. "Amazing," said Twig as he wandered on now. Now left and now right, now round a corner, now over a slope. It was all so mysterious, all so new. I think he went off the path. He stopped by a bank of quivering plants with tall spiky leaves and budded stems, all glinting in the moonlight. All at once the buds began to open, one by one, until the bank was covered with massive round flowers, with petals like shavings of ice, that turned their heads up to the moon and glowed with its brilliance. Twig smiled to himself and turned away. "Just a weeny bit further," he said. A tumblebush tumbled past him and disappeared into the shadows. Moon bells and tinkleberries jingled and jangled in the gathering wind. Then Twig heard another noise. He spun around. A small, sleek, furry brown creature with a corkscrew tail scurried across the forest floor, squeaking with terror. The screech of a wood owl sliced through the air. Here's a picture. See him way down there. Oh, right there. Yeah, right there. Okay. Okay. Twig's heart began to race. He looked around him wildly. There were eyes in the shadows, yellow eyes, green eyes, red eyes, and all of them staring at him. "Oh no," he moaned. "What have I done?" Twig knew what he'd done. Never stray from the path, Spelda had said, yet that was precisely what he'd done. Entranced by the silvery beauty of the Deepwoods, he had strayed from the safety of the path. Twig groaned. "I can't do anything right. Dum, 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 dum," he shouted at himself as he stumbled this way and that, desperately trying to find his way back to the path. Duh! All at once he heard something, a sound which silenced his voice and froze him to the spot. It was the wheezing pant of a halitoad, a huge and dangerous reptile with breath so foul it could stun its victim at 20 paces. At 10 paces, the stench was lethal. A single evil-smelling belch had been enough to kill Hodder Gruff's uncle. What could he do? Where could he go? Twig had never been away from the Deepwoods paths on his own before. He started this way, stopped, and he ran the other way, and stopped again. The sound of the wheezing halitoad seemed to be all around him. He darted into the shadows of some dark undergrowth and crouched down behind the trunk of a tall and lumpy tree. The halitoad came closer. Its rasping breath grew louder. Twig's palms were wet and his mouth was dry. He couldn't swallow. The fromps and the qualms fell silent, and in the awful stillness, Twig's heart beat like a drum. Surely the halitoad must be able to hear it. Perhaps it had gone? Twig peered cautiously around the trunk of the tree. "Mistake!" his brain screamed as he found himself staring into two yellow slit eyes glinting back at him from the darkness. A long coiled tongue flicked in and out, tasting the air. Suddenly the halitoad inflated like a bullfrog. It was about to blast its jet of venomous breath. Twig closed his eyes, held his nose, and clamped his mouth shut. He heard a fizzing hiss. The next moment there was a muffled thud from behind him as something fell to the ground. Twig nervously opened one eye and inspected. A fromp was lying on the forest floor. Its furry, prehensile tail was twitching. Twig remained perfectly still as the halitoad shot out its sticky tongue, grasped the hapless fromp, and scuttled off with it into the undergrowth. There's the halitoad. "That was close," Twig said and sighed with relief. He wiped sweat from his brow. "Too close." The moon had turned milky and the shadows had deepened. As Twig wandered miserably on, the gloom clung to him like a damp blanket. The halitoad might have gone, but that was the least of his worries. The fact remained that he had strayed from the path. Now he was lost. Often Twig stumbled, sometimes he fell. His hair became wet with sweat, though his bones were chilled to the marrow. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know where he'd been. He hoped he wasn't simply going around and around in circles. He was also tired, yet each time he paused to rest, a howl or a snarl or a ferocious roar would set him trotting off again. At last, unable to go any farther, Twig stopped. He sank to his knees and lifted his head to the sky. "Oh, Glumgloser!" he cursed. "Glumgloser! Glumgloser!" His voice rang out in the frosty night air. "Please, please, please," he cried. "Help me find the path again. If only I hadn't left the path. Help me, help me, help me! Help!" The cry of distress cut through the air like a knife. Twig jumped to his feet and looked around. "Help me!" It wasn't an echo. The voice was coming from Twig's left. Instinctively, he ran to see what he could do. The next moment, he stopped again. What if it was a trap? He remembered Tum-Tum's blood-curdling tales of wood trolls who had been lured to their death by the false calls of the dagger slash, a monstrous creature with 40 razor-sharp claws. It looked like a fallen log until you stepped on it, then its paws would snap shut. And so they would remain until the body of the victim had started to decay. For the dagger slash only ate carrion. "For pity's sake, help me, someone!" came the voice again, but weaker now. Twig could not ignore the desperate plea a moment longer. He drew his knife, just in case, and set off toward the voice. He hadn't gone more than 20 paces when he tripped over something sticking out from the bottom of a humming comb bush. "Ouch!" cried the voice. Twig spun around. He tripped on a pair of legs. Their owner sat up and glared at him angrily. "You oaf!" he exclaimed. "I'm sorry, Twig began. "And don't stare," he interrupted. "It's very rude." "I'm sorry, Twig said again. It was true, he was staring. A shaft of moonlight was shining down through the forest onto a boy, and the sight of his red raw face, crimson hair, waxed into flame-like points, and necklaces of animal teeth had startled Twig. "You're a slaughterer, aren't you?" he said. With their bloodied appearance, the slaughterers looked and sounded ferocious. It was said that the generations of spilt blood had seeped through their pores and down into their follicles of their hair. Yet although their business was indeed the butchery of the tilder they hunted and the hamel horns they reared, the slaughterers were a peaceful folk. Nevertheless, Twig could not hide his revulsion. Apart from the occasional deep-wood traveler, the slaughterers were the wood trolls' nearest neighbors. They traded together, carved wooden items and basketware for meat and leather goods. However, the wood trolls, like everyone else in the Deepwoods, despised the slaughterers. They were, as Spelda put it, the bottom of the pot. No one wanted to associate with the folk who had blood, not only on their hands, but all over their bodies. Here's what he looks like. He has his shoe off, too. "Well," said Twig, "are you a slaughterer?" "What if I am?" said the boy defensively. "Nothing, Lost in the Deepwoods, you couldn't afford to be too choosy about your companions. "I'm Twig," he said. The boy touched his forehead lightly and nodded. "My name's Gristle," he said. "Please take me back to my village. I can't walk. Look," he said, and pointed to his right foot. Twig saw the 6 or 7 angry purple marks at the back of his heel. Already the whole foot had swollen to twice its normal size. Even as Twig watched, the swelling spread up his leg. "What's happening?" asked Twig. It's... Twig realized the boy was staring at something behind him. He heard something hiss and spun around, and there, hovering just above the ground, was the vilest creature Twig had ever seen. It was long and lumpy, with luminous green slime skin that glistened moistly in the milky moonlight. Along the length of its body were bulging yellow spots that oozed a clear liquid. Wiggling and squirming, the creature fixed Twig with its huge cold eyes. "What is it?" he whispered to Gristle. There it is right there. A hoverworm, came the reply. Whatever you do, don't let it get you. No chance, said Twig bravely, and reached for his knife. It wasn't there. My knife, he cried. My naming knife, And then Twig remembered. He had been carrying it when he tripped over Gristle's legs. It must be on the ground somewhere. Twig stared ahead, too terrified to take his eyes off the hoverworm for so much as a second. The creature continued to writhe. The hissing sound was coming not from his mouth, but from the rows of ducts along the underside. They expelled air which kept the worm hovering aloft. It moved nearer, and Twig found himself staring at the creature's mouth. It had rubbery lips and floppy feelers, and gulped constantly at the air. Suddenly the lips parted. Twig gasped. The hoverworm's mouth was full of tentacles, each one with a dripping sucker at the end. As the jaws widened, the tentacles sprang out and wiggled like maggots. The knife, Twig muttered to Gristle. Find my knife. He heard Gristle rummaging through the dry leaves. I'm trying, he said. I can't. Yes, he cried. I've got it. Quick, said Twig desperately. The hoverworm was quivering, ready to attack. He reached behind his back for the knife. Hurry up! Here, said Gristle, and Twig felt the familiar bone handle in his palm. He closed his hand around it and gritted his teeth. The hoverworm swayed in the air backwards and forwards, and trembling all the while, Twig waited. Then suddenly, with no warning, the hoverworm struck. It flew at Twig's neck, mouth agape and tentacles taut. It stank of rancid grease. Here it is coming at him. Blech! Terrified Twig leapt back. The hoverworm abruptly switched direction in midair and came at him from the other side. Twig ducked. The creature shot over his head, hissed to a halt, coiled itself around, and attacked again. This time it came from the front, just as Twig had hoped. As the creature's tentacles were about to suction themselves onto his exposed neck, Twig twisted around and lunged forward. The knife plunged into the soft underbelly of the worm and ripped along the row of ducts. The effect was instant. Like a balloon that had been inflated and released, the creature spun wildly through the air with a loud "f". Then it exploded, and a mass of small slimy scraps of yellow and green skin fluttered down to the ground. Yay! Twig roared and punched the air. I've actually been and gone and done it! The hoverworm is dead! As he spoke, dragon smoke billowed from his mouth. The night had become bitter with an icy north wind. Yet Twig was not cold, far from it. A glow of pride and excitement warmed his whole body. Help me! Came a voice from behind him. It sounded strange, as though Gristle was talking while eating. It's okay, said Twig, as he pulled himself to his feet. Gristle! He screamed. The slaughter was all but unrecognizable. Before Twig's battle with the hoverworm, Gristle's leg had been swollen. Now his entire body had swelled up. He looked like a huge dark red ball. Oh my gosh, look at him. Oh my gosh. Take me home, he mumbled unhappily. But I don't know where your home is, said Twig. I'll tell you, said Gristle. Lift me up. I'll give you directions. Twig bent down and gathered the slaughterer up in his arms. He was surprisingly light. Twig started walking. Le, said Gristle a while later, followed by le again. Right, straight, on. As Gristle continued to swell, even the simplest words became impossible. In the end, he had to press his pudgy hands against Twig's shoulders to indicate which way to go. If Twig had been going in circles before, he certainly wasn't now. He was being steered towards somewhere new. Wobble, wobble, Gristle shouted. Wobble, wobble! What? Said Twig sharply, but even as he spoke, he realized what was happening. Gristle's body, which had been light when he'd picked him up, was now less than weightless. The massive, bulging mass was on the point of floating up and away. He tried his best to hold on around Gristle's waist, at least, the place where his waist had once been, but it was impossible. It was like holding a sack full of water. The difference being that this particular sack was trying to fall upwards. If he let go, Gristle would disappear into the sky. Twig wiped the sweat from his brow. Then he wedged the inflated boy between two branches, taking care to choose a tree without any thorns. He didn't want Gristle to burst. He pulled the rope Spelda had given him from his shoulder, tied one end to Gristle's leg and the other around his own waist, and set off once more. It wasn't long before Twig was in difficulty again. With each step, the upward pull grew stronger. It became more and more difficult to remain on the ground. He clutched hold of the branches of bushes he passed to keep himself anchored, but it was no good. The slaughterer was simply too buoyant. All at once, Twig's legs were dragged off the ground. Uh-oh. His hands lost their grip on the branches, and he and Gristle floated up into the air. Up and up they went, into the icy night and towards open sky. Twig tore in vain at the knotted rope around his waist. It wouldn't budge. He stared down at the fast receding ground, and as he did so, something occurred to him. Something awful. Gristle would be missed. His family and friends would come looking for him when he didn't return. Twig, on the other hand, had done what wood trolls never did. He had strayed from the path. No one would come looking for him. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, the next chapter is called The Slaughterers. Bye-bye.